Welcome back to part 2 about 512 vector sequencer. Picking up last time, we looked at kind of the basics of dialing in, programming a part, all the basic functions that are included with the sequencer. I have the part that we made at the end of last video up here, and if you want to start fresh, you want to clear it out, you just hold Shift and you hit number 8, and it'll clear it out, it'll put you back where you were. I've gone ahead and dialed in just a real simple set of pitches here. You can see the first 4 notes are A and the second 4 notes are C. And all that is just to make it so that it's easier to hear what's happening. Okay, super exciting. Now, before we jump into the subsequencers, I want to remind you, on this particular part, we have the start of one, a length of 8. That means there's going to be 8 steps as we go. And the default rate for that step is going to be a 16th note. So if we look at the modulation page, I mentioned last time that each part has 2 subsequencers. One of the things that you might notice right off the bat is that it has a similar set of parameters here, but they can be different values. So here you can see, even though our part has a step, it's a length of 8 steps, and the step duration is a 16th note, you can see here the subsequencer has a length of 4, it has its own direction, and the rate is a quarter note. So what that means is that this will be running at the same clock as our part, and a quarter note means that for every 4 16th notes that are happening in our part, our subsequencer will be changing its value. Now, this over here is probably the most important value on the subsequencer, and that is what the subsequencer changes. So there's only a couple of things here that you can change. You can transpose up and down. You can change the octave. You can change the rate. You can change the direction, and you can change the start point. So when I first saw this, I was a little underwhelmed that there was only this handful of things, but it turns out that this is actually really powerful. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we set it to transpose. So remember, we have a length of 4, so we're only looking at these first 4. So the first time it plays through, we'll have no transpose. The second time it plays through, maybe we'll transpose it up by a 5th. And then the third and fourth time it plays through, we won't transpose it at all. So that maybe wasn't super exciting, but this is actually powerful for, you can set this length a whole lot longer, and you can have this really evolve what are fairly basic sequences by modifying these. Now, the one that I'm most interested in actually is, we're looking at the second one there, the one that I'm actually most interested in is this one, which is the start point. Now, before I show you that on the vector sequencer, let me show you some sheet music to show you why I think that this is interesting. So this is, you don't have to be able to read sheet music, by the way, in order to follow this. The only thing you need to know is to be able to look at patterns. So just looking at this top row here, if you look, you can see that there's a very distinct rhythmic pattern that happens, right? We see it right here. We see it right here. We see it right here. And if you skip ahead, we see it again, we see it again, we see it again. Okay, so what's happening here is this song has a little bit more of a traditional composition. And in that style of composition, what you do is you create rhythmic motifs, and you form those rhythmic motifs into a phrase. Now, a phrase is typically made up of 2 rhythmic motifs, a primary and a secondary. So in this case, this is a motif, this is a motif, this is a motif. These all 3 are the same motifs. This would be the primary motif. We have it 3 times. It's the most repeated, the most dominant. And then our secondary motif would be this set of 4 triplets here. Now, this whole thing here, like these 3 motifs along with this secondary motif, this whole thing would actually be considered a phrase. And you can see right at the start that we actually get this phrase once, and then we get this phrase twice. Now, The function of the subsequencer to allow you to change the start position, I find extremely relevant if you want to think about composition in this way. Because if you think about a part as a phrase, which is this whole bit of notes right here, if you think about that part, what you could do is you could say, my part is, say, 16 steps long, and the first 8 steps are my primary motif, and the second 8 steps are my secondary motif, and then you can use the subsequencer to simply jump between which position in that 16-step sequence that you want to play. And the reason why it doesn't just keep going around is because you might recall that our parts also have a part length. Now, in order to make this easier to see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial down the part length to 4, just because then we'll be able to see it happening here. So if I hit play, you can see we're limited to just those 4. But what we can do is we can come over here, and remember, our subsequencer is set to a quarter note, so every 4 steps the subsequencer will fire. What we can do is we can say, okay, the first time through, leave it alone. The second time through, leave it alone. And the third time through, our starting point will be 5. Now what that means is the third time our part plays through, instead of starting here, it's going to jump and it's going to start here. Yeah. So what's happening here is we have one part that we've basically split into 2 motifs, and then we can use the subsequencer ultimately to control the order that those motifs play in. So let's say that we wanted to reproduce what I had just showed you on that sheet music. We could say it plays through 3 times, and then the 4th time we're going to get a different motif. And let's make this a little bit more interesting by changing around some of the pitches here, because otherwise it's going to get kind of annoying. So I didn't design any of that. I just sort of turned the knobs. But you can hear it has a little bit more of that form, right? We hear something 3 times, which is a nice odd number, and then we hear this other thing. And it breaks up the monotony of just going through the same 8 notes over and over and over. Right? You can feel it's starting to create this rhythm, this dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, this part here. You rely on that, and then your ear gets kind of broken up by hearing that. Now, we could develop this even more by using the second subsequencer. So we've just been looking at subsequencer 1. I'm going to do the same thing for 4. Sorry, for subsequencer 2. And this time, let's change the octave. So one of the things I would like to do is when I'm listening to this, that secondary motif, it sounds a little low. And we could go through and we could bump it up, but I think it would be interesting to actually change the octave as we go. So I'm going to increase this to 8. And so that means that here we can modify it, and here we can modify it. So this is going to modify our secondary, and this will also modify our secondary. Maybe just for some interest, I'll bump up the octave there too. Yeah, So that's subsequencers. Have fun, everyone.